right, we are back with part 3 of episode 34 of This Week at FCPA. Continuing our discussion on what changes, if any, should be made to the FCPA. Let's talk about successor liability, where you have a corporation that buys another corporation, and the normal idea right now is that when you buy a corporation, you buy their FCPA liability. Right. We've seen a lot of that, and that was actually the complaint in Watts Water made by the attorney yesterday, that Watts Water was a purchase of a China subsidiary, far-flung, and that they shouldn't be liable for the problems in that company. The proposal that I've heard is that a company would have a certain amount of time in which, after the purchase, in which to investigate the company that they just purchased, and if they find something, they can disclose and be immunized from liability for that violation. Is that the proposal that you've heard? Have you heard alternate proposals, and what do you think of it?
Well, actually, the proposal I heard is to do away with successor liability.
Okay.
The proposal you just articulated actually exists today, and it's available to companies today. And it's available, we have two sources of information on that. The first is the opinion release 0802, or the Halliburton opinion release, where Halliburton was in negotiations to purchase a foreign company, and they were concerned that they would not have time to do the pre-acquisition due diligence to perform adequate due diligence to determine if there were any potential FCPA problems. And they proposed to the department a very aggressive post-acquisition schedule of 60, 120, and 180 days, I believe, where they would risk rank third parties and simply investigate the third parties, and in each of those specified time period, a high, medium, and low risk. And then they would turn over to the department the results of their investigation. Halliburton was not successful in that acquisition, so they did not engage in that exercise post-acquisition. But in the Johnson & Johnson DPA of 2011, in their enhanced compliance obligations, Johnson & Johnson agreed to the following obligation in any acquisition going forward. Within 12 months, they would train the risk-ranked or highest-ranked employees of the acquired company in Johnson & Johnson's FCPA program, which I would have to say is clearly best practices. And second of all, within 18 months, they would perform a full FCPA forensic audit of the acquired company and turn over their findings to the department. Now, I recognize that's an agreement between the department and Johnson & Johnson, binding only upon those two parties. Nevertheless, both of those pieces of information give us guidance that if you perform those activities, I think will go a long way towards ameliorating any potential successor liability you might have with under the FCPA with the Department of Justice. If you take those steps, if you turn over that information and self-disclose to the department, you may well come out at the end of the day with either a declination, perhaps an NPA or books and records. Nevertheless, companies need to engage in this type of exercise for a couple of reasons. One is, if you're acquiring a company, you better know who you're acquiring, and that's common business sense. But in the FCPA context, if you've had a company that has engaged in bribery and corruption previously, that shows a propensity to do it in the future, and not only may you be buying a prior violation, but you may be buying an ongoing or forward violation. The second point is, if a company's business model in any way, shape, or form is based on bribery and corruption, the value of their company would be reduced if that business model or that component of the business model was removed, or component of the sales model, however it's factored in. So you may have grossly overpaid for business, and it may not be worth anything close to what you paid. So these are things that you need to do anyway. And I'm very comfortable with the information the department has presented to the public, once again in those two formats, that companies have an essential safe harbor now.
So I think two things. One is, I agree with you. I think that the idea of eliminating successor liability entirely is wrong-headed for a couple of reasons. One, I think it would effectively kill pre-acquisition due diligence, which I think is crucial from a business perspective.
Right.
It would be much tougher to have compliance included as a work stream in the pre-acquisition due diligence, because, what's the point, right? I think that the 0802 was interesting, and I don't know how generally applicable it is, because if I remember correctly, and I might be confusing 0801 and 0802, but weren't there restrictions on the pre-acquisition due diligence that they could do in 0802?
They were time constrained, and then they also could only look at the target company was publicly identified as Expro. They could only look at Expro's books and records. They didn't have the right to go to Expro's third parties when they weren't Halliburton's third parties.
So I think that there were potential. I don't know how generally applicable that would be, but even so, I think that first of all, eliminating it entirely, I could envision a future where companies game the system, because there's no reason that a company that knows it has problems can't merge into a public shell, can't merge, game the mergers and acquisition system, and merge with another company, and where you have a huge company buying a small company and technically merging into the small company. And all of a sudden that small company is now saying, well, wait a second, you can't prosecute me, that was them. I think I could just see that being done. Why not? It's, we're going to pay, 30 million, 40 million for the small company when we have 300 million of potential liability. I would recommend that if that were the state of the law. So I think that it creates negative incentives. I think that, you shouldn't be able to escape liability for bad acts just because, you're no longer around. Now, we have seen if the bad actor truly no longer exists, right, then there really is no corporate liability. Now, individual liability, we have a statute of limitations. That's the limit on when you can be prosecuted. It's not a question of who you're under. If you pay a bribe over here, 3.5, 4 years later, you can be prosecuted even if you're working for a different company.
Right.
So on an individual level, there's a statute of limitations. On a corporate level, if the corporation truly no longer exists, then there is no corporate liability for that company. And I don't think the department would say, that for the new company, for the purchaser, they could say, well, we want to hold this other company which no longer exists liable. That's no longer the case. And look at what we have done since then. We can guarantee that there's no bribery going on now. The bigger problem in my mind is what happens with the contracts that were obtained through bribery. Because really, the new company has to cancel those. Right. The new company cannot, have incoming revenue based on contracts that were through bribes. They're going to have to disgorge that, and they're going to be seen as adopting that old company's, practices. So I just don't see it. I think that it's not unreasonable. It's not unreasonable in my mind to allow for this kind of post-acquisition diligence having an effect, almost legislating 0802, and turning that into a generally applicable avenue. I don't know, and I think that the DOJ should say, look, if you acquire a company, and that's a bad company, and you want to turn it to be into a good company, and there's what to be good there. It's not a total criminal enterprise, and you can show that you've identified the contracts obtained through bribes, and you're going to cancel those out. That you're implementing your compliance program into the new company. I don't necessarily think that the department would look on that harshly. I think that they would prosecute the old violations. I don't think that, and I think that you could make a strong argument that you shouldn't penalize a corporation that no longer exists. That it's not part of us, and it's not fair that it come out of our coffers. Punish the individuals who committed the bribery. I think that's a perfectly rational argument. I think that, I'm trying to think of whether or not we've seen otherwise, where we've seen the department prosecute and make a new parent company pay for a defunct company's operation.
Really, the only one was the Elandia Ladnode cases,
right?
From a couple of years ago. That's really the only one that comes to mind. But it brings up another reason you articulated for the criticalness of the pre-acquisition due diligence, to recognizing the time pressures you would be under in the limited time frame and limited information you might have available to you, which is you need to factor in the cost for remediation of any issues and upgrading the compliance program from the new company. And that should be a cost that you factor into your acquisition transition plan.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And either way, you're going to be paying for the diligence, whether it's pre-acquisition or post-acquisition.
Yes.
Allowing post-acquisition due diligence would also allow, I think that the business would be incentivized to do some pre-acquisition due diligence to ensure they have the valuation correct. But I think that it would also, part of the pressure and the difficulty of mergers and acquisitions diligence is the often shortened timeframes in which you have to do it. And I think saying, look, we need to do some to make sure that we have the valuation correct, but we have 120 days, in which to do it. So let's not freak out. Let's do it right. I think that, that's a much stronger, you're in a stronger position to do that. But I think eliminating it entirely just, would let companies game it, frankly. So, all right, so that is pre-acquisition due diligence, and we'll go on in a moment to part 4.